everybody, and you're very welcome to join us for Northern Voices. Since it was established 4 years ago, Bray Literary Festival has always been viewed as a sort of all-Ireland festival, and we've had plenty of writers from the north of Ireland in the past. So this is, I think, the first time that we put together an actual panel to represent Northern Voices as such. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome Jan Carson, Rosemary Jenkinson, and Malachi Docherty.
Docherty.
Docherty, I beg your pardon, Malachi O. Docherty. That's a great start. Okay, so without further ado, maybe I'll first ask Jan Carson to do a short reading. So Jan Carson's published work includes two novels, Malcolm Orange Disappears and The Fire Starters, and a short story collection, Children, with Whittrick Press, and also a microfiction collection called Postcard Stories. And her novel, The Fire Starters, from Doubleday, won the EU Prize for Literature for Ireland 2019. And then, as some of you will know, very recently, Jan has a short story shortlisted for the BBC short story competition, which is congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Jan.
Thank you.
Okay, so would you like to tell us a little bit about what you'd like to read?
Yeah, I thought I'd read something new, so I'm going to read an extract from a short story called Troubling the Waters. It was a commission for the Freelands Foundation, which is an art institute over in London, and they asked me to write something on the theme of old land, new waters, but very much specific to where I live in Belfast and East Belfast. So this is a story which is set in the Templemore Baths, which are currently, it's an old Victorian kind of bathhouse and swimming pool, and they're currently being refurbished, but it's a wonderful, wonderful space. And the basic storyline is an older people's knit and natter club, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It's basically a load of old ladies getting together to knit and bitch in the afternoon. And a rumour has gone round that there is a Polish lady who swims at the Templemore Baths, and once she gets into the water, the next person who gets in after her will be healed. Bit of a play on the story from the Bible, but it's Kathleen we're following here, and Mary has just told her about this phenomenon. It's not true, said Kathleen. The thing about the pool and getting healed is in the Bible. It's one of Jesus's miracles. Is it? I don't know that one. Well, if it's in the Bible, then it must be true. Aye, for Bible times maybe, not for now in East Belfast. You're probably right there, Kathleen. If Jesus was going to do a miracle nowadays, he'd probably go somewhere a bit classier than the Templemore Baths. There's that waterslide park over in Lisburn. The Grandwayans love it. He'd probably go somewhere like that. He would indeed, said Kathleen, and shortly after hung up. She tried to put the Templemore Baths to the back of her mind. She knew it was nonsense or pure coincidence. Swimming was good for sick people. Doctors were always banging on about gentle exercise. Everybody felt better for having been to the baths. It was nothing to do with the foreign girl appearing, nothing at all. But then again, what if the rumours were true? They were living in strange times. Bill was only after telling her a fella in England had given birth to a baby, and in the States there were holy rollers claiming they could raise the dead. She didn't know what to believe anymore. At the end of the day, thought Kathleen, was there any real harm in taking Bill to the baths? Better to chance your arm and be disappointed than miss out for fear of looking daft. She didn't sleep a wink all night for considering it, and by breakfast time had decided, yes, they would go down there on Friday morning, though she'd have to make it look coincidental, like it was nothing to do with the girl being there. Half the knit and natter had had the same idea. By the time Kathleen got Bill out of his wheelchair, into his trunks, and transferred into the special hoist, the other ladies were emerging from their own cubicles. Agnes, with her blood pressure, Mary, who suffered with lumbago, Deirdre and Evelyn, who had so many complaints between them, Kathleen could never keep track of who was crippled with what from one week to the next. They lingered round the pool like elephants toeing the edge of a watering hole. Nobody wanted to be the first one in. It was important to maintain an air of nonchalance. You couldn't let the others see you'd come here looking to get healed, for you'd only feel a right Egypt when it didn't happen. There'd been a similar standoff last November when Poundland ran a Black Friday special on selection boxes. They'd all turned up at 10 to 9, ready to grab enough for every one of their grandbabies, and, confronted by the others, felt the need to mask their desperation. They'd made a sterling attempt at pretending to be there for toothpaste or toilet cleaner, and only stumbling upon the selection box offer by chance. This morning they eyed each other suspiciously across the water and mumbled their excuses. Agnes was trying to lose a bit of weight. Mary had mixed her days up and come down to the bath thinking it was aqua aerobics day. Evelyn and Deirdre claimed the doctor had prescribed swimming to ease their various complaints, and spotting a perfect opportunity, Kathleen jumped on the back of their excuse. She said the specialist had told Bill the very same thing. She looked to her husband, hoping for an alibi, and when he didn't offer one, stood lightly on his naked foot, so he got the message. Yes, he said, nodding. The specialist thought the water might help with his pain. The specialist had said no such thing, but the two of them had been together long enough to understand when backup was required. Kathleen hadn't told Bill that she hoped a dip in the Templemore baths might cure his terminal cancer. She had found herself incapable of voicing the words. Though they seemed almost plausible in her head, out loud she knew they'd sound limp and ludicrous, like the punchline to a bad cracker joke. Instead, she'd appealed to her husband's romantic side. As teenagers, they'd spent many hours down the deep ends of the baths. The easts, with its tiny houses stacked one on top of the other, offered very little privacy for courting couples, and they'd soon learnt how to keep their faces casual and impassive, whilst beneath the waterline they touched each other through their swimsuits in blatant disregard of the sign forbidding heavy petting. Kathleen and Bill had fond memories of the baths. She'd asked him for one last dip, for old time's sake. Afterwards, she'd take him to SD Bell's for a fancy cup of coffee and a bun. It was not like Kathleen to ask for anything, so Bill conceded immediately, and had been somewhat baffled to find the other knitting natter ladies intruding upon their wee moment together. It was obvious that all 5 women were waiting for the foreign girl to appear. Kathleen understood their logic. She'd done her homework, fished the old King James version out of the bookcase and read the story before leaving the house. If this girl was anything like Jesus, and that was the assumption to end all assumptions, they'd have to wait for the spirit to trouble the water. Or, in local parlance, the cure wouldn't take if they weren't in the pool before her. If Agnes's furtive glancing was anything to go by, the girl was already here and changing in the cubicle furthest from the entrance. Kathleen could picture her in there, dragging her hair up into a high ponytail, contemplating a wee cappuccino after her swim, not for a minute anticipating 6 senior citizens waiting to suck the power out of her the instant she hit the water. Poor wee lassie, thought Kathleen. The young were never fully aware of their own capabilities. When she emerged, the girl was plainer than she'd imagined, a bit hefty around the thighs and just as pale as a local. She didn't look like a miracle. She looked like the kind of girl who cleaned toilets for a living. Still, you couldn't judge people on looks alone. Kathleen herself had been at school with a girl who ended up a novelist, and a more homely looking girl she'd never seen. She glanced across the room. Agnes was already inclined towards the pool's edge, her weight resting on her front leg like a runner poised at the starting blocks. Mary was all business too, her face folded in grim concentration. So it has come to this, thought Kathleen. They were pitching themselves against each other, for it was only the first to hit the water who'd get the good of the miracle. Everybody else was just going to get wet. Kathleen's dying husband didn't seem to give her any natural advantage. It was every knit and natter lady for herself this morning. Damn them all, she thought. I deserve this. As the girl curled her toes around the pool's lip and prepared to dive, Kathleen wrapped her arms around her husband's flabby belly and with all the strength she could muster, jumped. I'll leave it there.
Lovely. That's great. Thanks a lot. Now, a word that has cropped up in relation to your work when I've been looking at reviews in The Guardian at Times or whatever is surrealist. And obviously, I mean, in something like The Fire Starters, you've got the siren figure coming out of the Lagaon and Jonathan Gipi. We don't know how much is in his head and the whole thing with Sophie, etc., etc. Malcolm Orange disappearing in Malcolm Orange Disappears, the 11-year-old. What is it that draws you to, whether you like to call it surrealism or fantasy or magical realism, or what do you think is the draw there for you, Jen?
I think it's not a draw for me, it's just the way I write. And I started writing in one particular way with these fantastical elements woven through the realism. And it was only much, much later. It was actually Sinead Morrissey who pressed a copy of Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum on me and went, do you know you're a magic realist? That's what you are. And suddenly I realized there was a name for it. I guess I'm particularly drawn to magic realism in the context of Northern Ireland, because the history of it and the tradition of it, it's often places that have troubled, complicated backgrounds, and writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Gunter Grass have used the lens of something absurd or surreal or fantastical to draw attention. Flannery O'Connor is my big hero as a short story writer, and she talks about, you know, she's asked why she uses the grotesque in her work, and she says, you know, for the hard of hearing you shout, and for the blind you use large and startling images. And the stories of Northern Ireland have been told so many times, particularly the narratives around the Troubles, that to bring in an absurd, strange element, it just shocks people into possibly paying attention in a different way.
Yeah, yeah. When you mentioned Gunter Grass, and I hadn't actually thought about that before, and Garcia Marquez, Salman Rushdie as well. I mean, he's looking at the contested history between at the partition of India, you know, the different communities.
I mean, there's a huge influence of Midnight's Children on the Firestarters. Midnight's Children's my favorite novel, so I will plagiarize the hell out of it every chance I get. I think it's a work of genius.
And then Gunter Grass was treading that line in Danzig between the Polish and the German communities. It was doing the same thing, yeah. And it struck me that, just thinking back to my knowledge of literature from Northern Ireland, going back 30 years, I was always drawn to Kieran Carson in his poetry about the North. And I don't know, would you quite call that magical realist or fantasy or kind of grotesque woodcut sort of things, music and all that, but it was a very different way of representing it from, say, you know, a realist perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the backdrop of Northern Ireland is already tottering on the edge of something hyper real or possibly absurd. And I don't mean absurd in the kind of funny sense, I mean it more in the kind of Beckett sense of absurdism. This idea that we have so many really quite strange images when you think about them out of context, and some of the stories and it's very easy to laugh at Northern Ireland because there are so many of these kind of strange things that have happened here and strange narratives and big larger than life characters. So I think that line between the real and the surreal is quite thin. And it always amazes me that there haven't been more writers who have tapped into it. You do see it a wee bit in Brian Moore's work. I really, really love The Emperor of Ice Cream, and some of the stuff that he wrote in Canada definitely tips into the magic realist genre. But there's not as much of it as you'd think in the Northern Irish canon.
I know when I was writing it was just a Goodreads review of Milkman by Anna Burns, I was saying it was halfway between Kafka and Alice in Wonderland. It was kind of a through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole kind of world, which was almost had that childish nightmare Beckett humor going on, which is again a very interesting way to present the whole scenario.
Yeah, and even more so in her other novels. I think there's lots of lines where you're not actually sure, are we in the real or are we in the unreal at this point? And that's why she's such a genius, because, you know, she's aware that she's not a patronizing writer. She leaves a lot for the reader to interpret and to think about.
Yeah, it may be a novel we come back to in the general discussion. Okay, that's fabulous. Thanks a lot for that, Jan. And next I'm going to invite Rosemary Jenkinson to give us a reading. So a little introduction of Rosemary. Rosemary Jenkinson is a playwright and short story writer from Belfast. She was 2017 Artist in Residence at the Lyric Theatre and received a major individual artist award from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland 2019. She was a recent writer in their residence with the Irish Writers' Centre here in Dublin. Her previous short story collections are Contemporary Problems, numbers 53 and 54, Aphrodite's Kiss, Catholic Boy, and much more recently, Lifestyle Choice 10 milligrams, which was published by Doire Press just as the lockdown kicked in, if I remember right, so we didn't actually have the real launch. Okay, Rosemary, can I invite you up to give us a bit of a reading?
Yes. Are you inviting me up? I don't think I'm going to be moving actually here, but
podium here in our heads.
Okay, so I'm reading from Lifestyle Choice 10 milligrams, and I'm going to read the story Lifestyle Choice 10 milligrams just to be different. Okay. But yeah, here we go. Sometimes you think you're going to get back into the swing of things when life swings right back at you. It was 6 months after my back operation and I'd thrown out the painkillers and was feeling so much better. I moved into a new house with a brand new housemate. I also started a 6-month contract at the examinations board. I thought maybe I could meet a guy, but I'd forgotten that admin offices are so populated by females, they're practically like girls' schools. At any rate, now I was fit and healthy, I could at least make some friends. By my second week in the office, I hadn't made any friends. My boss, Laura, was a bottle brunette who was loud and gesticulative. Sometimes it looked like she wanted to karate chop you. There was one other long-term inmate, Mary Louise, who had a phone permanently clamped to her head like a handle and lipstick that bright you couldn't keep your eyes off her lips. Though to be fair, the conversation that emitted from them didn't warrant the same attention. Mary Louise was exceedingly deferential to Laura, as if scared she would suddenly make some fatal mistake. It was more as if she was a junior surgeon than an office worker. That was the real problem with our office. Every time you turned, Laura was watching you. Apart from myself, there was one other temp, Hannah. She was 2 years younger than me and married. Mary Louise, who never tired of talking about her aspiring actress daughter, Shawneen, kept making presumptuous hints about it being time Hannah had kids. I liked Hannah, but she was so efficient, she made me look bad. I thought to myself, how the hell am I going to last 6 months? When I arrived home at the end of that week, I wasn't sure if the aches and pains in my back were physical or spiritual, but I definitely regretted throwing out the tramadol. I decisively rapped on my housemate Paddy's door. Do you have any painkillers? Yep, these are the biz, Alice, he said, ushering me in and opening a drawer. These babies will smooth you out real sweet. Paddy's not much into more than a bit of dope and the odd coke insufflation, but that's the thing about drugs. When people talk about them, they tend to talk like a cool-ass dealer from the Bronx. I walked out with them in my hand, Cocodamol 30. I banged a couple the next morning for breakfast. By the time I got to work, I felt very chilled. I could actually feel this low-level smile on my face, and what was more, I was functioning. Although, to be fair, the job of stuffing letters into envelopes could have been accomplished by a chimp, but the main point was that morning was speeding along nicely. In the afternoon, Laura sent me to the photocopier, and I dallied somewhat, enjoying being out of the office. After 15 minutes, she came out to find me, not looking best pleased. It was only a few pages, Alice, she snapped. It's not the entire phone book. The next morning, I went to the doctors about my back. One of the great things about Northern Ireland is that prescriptions are free on account of us having been so troubled by the Troubles. He prescribed me some Butrans, a pain patch I'd used before for my back. I had to sign for them at the front desk as they're a controlled drug. I then ran round to Boots with the script and it was like Fort Knox. It took about 10 minutes for the safe to open. Anyway, I slapped on the patch and headed to the bus stop. It was already 9:30 and I should have phoned Laura, but Belfast is the Bermuda Triangle for buses. You're lucky if they turn up at all. By the time the bus pulled up, my stress rate was starting to go through the roof. May I see proof of your doctor's appointment? Laura asked straight away. It was hard not to take the lack of trust personally, but it was the culture of the place. That very week, the building was being installed with clocking in cards, as the managers were concerned the staff weren't putting in a full day's work. During the coffee break, Laura took us over to the machine to show us how it worked. Jesus, it's like we're wage slaves back in the 20th century, I whispered to the others. Here, look what Shawneen had for dinner at the Theatre Awards, buzzed in Mary Louise, showing us poorly paid temps living on baked beans. A Facebook photo of delicious steak and courgette parcels. Mary Louise was the sort of person who would show it to a famine victim. By the afternoon, I'd popped a couple of cocodamols and the slow release Butrans was beginning to kick in. I bore in mind the fact that Laura had objected to my slowness the previous day, so I picked up the pace. I was packing the envelopes at a feral speed, enjoying the admiring murmurs of Hannah, when Laura called out, "Slow down there, Alice." She wasn't amused. I guess she saw it as showing up how easy and menial all our jobs were. She came over to my desk, eyed my envelopes suspiciously, and promptly sent me off to the guillotine. Who am I? Marie Antoinette? I couldn't help quipping, and Hannah laughed, precipitating a frown from Laura. When I returned, the mood in the office was somber. Laura pointed out that one of my envelopes hadn't been properly adhesed. She surveyed the edges of the guillotine paper with as much assiduity as if she was applying a spirit level to them. I returned, filling the envelopes at the glacial pace more suited to my chilled, medicated state. Marie-Louise's eyelashes fluttered hectically, like nervous moths when Laura spoke. I was tempted to pop a cocodamol into her Earl Grey that breakdown, just to help her relax. And Hannah's envelopes were perfect. She was almost too good to be true, but I often noticed that when she held a pen, her fingers were tense and white. That weekend, I had a great time. I discovered you couldn't get a hangover on Boutrans, as your head was already premedicated when you woke up the next morning. Paddy kindly gave me a new painkiller, Lyrica, which, being the cool dude he was, he called Bud. I gave him a couple of tins of tuna in return. Lyrica. It was a poetic name for a little red and white pill. I read the blurb inside, and it was an epilepsy drug used in low-level doses for pain. When I took it, it was mad, because the room literally lit up. Monday morning, I clocked in quite happily at work. I was glad to see Laura was smiling. "We saw you on TV," she smirked. Came back to me how over the weekend I'd met up with some friends who were at an anti-Donald Trump rally. I'd wandered into a cameraman's periphery and had inadvertently appeared on the TV screen. It had transpired that I was the talk of the building, since there was never much gossip around. I didn't particularly mind being cast in the role of office revolutionary, even though I was more anti-Trump's candy floss hair than his policies. A couple of supervisors came over to chat to me about the rally at the break, and I sensed that Laura's attempts to defame me as a troublemaker had actually elevated me. That's it.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for that reading, Rosemary. Again, when I read about your work, some of the comments usually are about the areas you write about they're often humorous. They're often touching on the erotic sometimes, touching on drugs sometimes. I often think in my own head, it's almost like a Hubert Selby world, but with a sense of humor to it.
Yeah, I love Hubert Selby. It's a good analogy.
With a sense of humor, though. So again, what is it do you think that makes you write in that way about contemporary Belfast?
Maybe it is a cliche, but I do love the wild writers and the Kerouacs and the William Burroughs, and I'm drawn by the romance of all that. And yeah, but I do believe the writer should be on the edge in life and explore the dark side. And I mean, drugs actually is a massive culture now anyway, so it's hardly a totally marginalized area to work in. And also those sort of erotica and drugs, they keep you young. You know, you're not like some sort of middle-aged writer writing about some domestic scenario. I think being in the streets is something I really aspire to write about, not just the home environment.
Okay. There's always an element of escapism about your protagonists, as far as I can make out, you know. Not exactly the frustrated escapism of the characters in Dubliners trying to get out of this dreary center of paralysis, but they always seem to be looking for some, I don't know, extra dimension almost. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I do think so. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I do believe in escaping reality is an important part of fiction. I mean, we read to escape reality, so we do many, many different things. And in fact, if you take the book Lifestyle Choice, 10 milligrams, and that story, it's like we all have our escapism that we need some release. And I think that was the real idea of the book. It's like the train spotting. Why do you do the heroin? It's that kind of thing. And yeah,
Choose
so that's
life.
what I'm, a what?
Choose life.
Choose life. Yeah. Lifestyle choice, Emily. You know, I just steal everything. We steal everything, don't we?
They always, what was it? Bad writers borrow and good writers steal, or something like that. I think T.S. Eliot said.
Plagiarize.
Yeah. You've also got a second literary string to the bow, which of course is as a playwright, an award-winning playwright. And I just want to bring that up as well. I mean, going right back to Bonfire won the Stuart Parker Award, isn't that right?
Yeah.
And you once said, I know people hate being held to what they said, but you once said that plays have more political impact.
Yeah.
You were saying that, but you did.
Oh, well, I agree. Yeah, because you've got the people in an enclosed space, you've got a group, so you feel that you're firing up people, whereas in a book, it's a kind of, they can leave that down, whereas I think they go out buzzing collectively from a political idea and they can discuss it afterwards. So that's the way, if you want a revolution, you do it through theatre, certainly not through a book. Well, I guess some books can inspire a revolution, but there would be a slow burn, whereas a theatre is a quick impact that galvanizes people.
Sure. And then with something like, say, Michelle and Arlene, we're
Yeah.
headed towards political satire there, I suppose.
Yeah, I love satire. I mean, and you couldn't write it right now anyway. And yeah, I'd love to do Boris, but as I say, theatres are closed right now, but
Yeah,
which is the
absolutely.
total, it is a disaster when we need satire, and we need to satirize COVID and the whole lockdown things, everything. So it's frustrating that theatres are closed.
I'd imagine it is, very much so.
Yeah.
Okay, next up then, I'd like to invite in Malachi O. Docherty. I'll get it right this time. Malachi, apologies for that.
Somebody in a previous generation found it very important, apparently.
So I'll give a brief introduction. I believe you're going to read a short piece from 50 Years On, and then if we have time at the end, which hopefully we will, maybe we get a chance to hear a little bit from your first novel, Terry Brankin Has a Gun, which would be lovely. We just see how time plays out. So Malachi O. Docherty is a Belfast author. He has 9 published books, mostly non-fiction. His first novel, Terry Brankin Has a Gun, was released by Merrion this year. His non-fiction work centres largely on the Northern Ireland Troubles. His response to cultural change in Northern Ireland, 50 Years On, has been published in paperback by Atlantic. Malachi lived in India for 4 years as the disciple of a Hindu Swami and is working on a memoir of that experience, which also sounds fascinating. So Malachi, can I invite you up to read for us, please?
Thank you very much. Yes, this is from 50 Years On, the troubles and the struggle for change in Northern Ireland. And it's written like journalism. It's based a lot on interviews with people on their experience. And the person we're talking about at the moment is called Leslie Carroll. And Leslie Carroll is a woman, a Presbyterian minister. I think she's actually currently the policing ombudsman. Can we say ombudsman about a woman? Can I have guidance on that? Okay. Anyway, that's what she is. Leslie Carroll, who was later ordained a Presbyterian minister in Belfast, recalled that the church she went to as a child in Newmills near Cull Island in County Tyrone was proud to have a Victoria Cross memorial. She said, and not every church in Northern Ireland has that, so that history was connected to the village. The congregation there included police officers and soldiers, and she said, people who probably had family connections to the UVF. A story from her teenage years well illustrates how religion insulated people from sectarian realities rather than encouraged them to confront them. According to Leslie, there was a kind of split between church and the world. So I remember, for example, one of the really shaping memories of my life was when Gertie and Jim Devlin were shot. Gertrude and James Devlin were driving home with their daughter one spring evening in May 1974 when a soldier stood out in front of their car and ordered them to stop. This looked like a routine search, common enough in those days. James stepped out of the car. Gunmen then fired on them. James fell beside the car. Gertrude died in her seat. Their daughter was wounded but survived. Leslie continued, they were significant members of the SDLP, ordinary nationalists, not interested in violence at all. Gertie worked in Coal Island Library with my aunt, so I knew her well. Jim not so well. And they were shot by the UVF simply because they were members of the SDLP and Catholics. And that was never mentioned in church. Never mentioned. So the religious cultures, that's still Leslie talking. So the religious culture was such that we were very pious. We prayed about a lot of things and talked about religion all the time, but no mention of that. I could never get my head around why there wasn't mention of our neighbors in that way. And it may have been that there were UVF families connected to the congregation. Who knows? A theological distinction between Catholicism and evangelical Protestantism may be relevant to this. Catholics pray for the souls of the dead to help get them into heaven. Evangelicals don't do this and even take offense when others do pray for Protestants who've died. This is because their faith tells them that they are either saved or not saved by grace and that the prayers of others play no part in this. Still, there would have been no heresy in praying for the family of the dead, for the wounded daughter, that she might have peace and comfort. That would have been the normal thing to do had the dead couple been Protestants. Leslie says that the culture she grew up in encouraged her to keep Catholics at a distance. She couldn't go to the funeral of the Devlins. We couldn't go over the door of a Catholic church. That would have been to give credence to this corrupt faith, papism, you know. This was, she maintained, about preserving their spiritual integrity. She and the people around her believed that they had a true religious conviction that had to be protected against dilution. They were on guard not just against Catholicism, but also the modern world. It was hard to maintain that distance when you had gregarious Catholic neighbours, though. She says, our next door neighbours were two Catholic sisters and their brothers were all priests in Africa and all sorts of places. And when the brothers came home, they used to come round to visit. So I'll never forget, and my father will never forget, the first time one of those priests was coming up the driveway. There was kind of, oh my goodness, look who's coming up the path, panic in the house. But the Carrolls were polite neighbours and would not turn him away, even though the priest's visit was an embarrassment and a challenge to their evangelical reserve. She says, we became the best of friends, but you wouldn't have had that mix normally. That was something alien. That was the nature of that community. And we were not a minority among Protestants. The purity of Christianity had to be protected. On a religious level, you wouldn't have allowed anything into your thoughts or into the arena of your experience that might have corrupted that purity. And Catholicism would have done that. And by extension, Catholics would have done that. But if religion was divisive in one way, it was also at times a powerful counter to violent impulses. The soldier who led the UVF killers to the Devlin home that night in May 1974 later went to an evangelical service in Dungannon and found God and repented. The judge said to him, it's a pity he did not become a Christian before May the 7th, 1974. So there you are. I mean, I was just thinking about what Jan was saying as well about the how how it's almost easier to approach Northern Ireland's realities by writing about the surreal, about it being magical. And that resonated with me when I was thinking about this as well. I think, these people are insane. What these people are doing is completely mad. Freaking out because your Catholic neighbor is walking up the path to knock the door. Not going to the church, not even having a wee prayer in church for a neighbor shot dead beside, husband and wife shot dead, even when you work alongside them in the library in Dungannon. This is all completely bonkers.
Sure, yeah.
But real.
Well, I suppose my first question to you, Malachi, would be, how does one write as a journalist or a political journalist or a recent historian or any of those things in a contested society? What are the imperatives and what are the dangers, shall we say?
Well, one of the dangers is that you get an enormous amount of abuse online. In some ways, you get far more abuse now with the internet than I did, certainly as a working journalist during the Troubles themselves. There is a kind of an oddity about things that people who might be really quite extreme in some ways can also be civil and friendly. I think one of the things that overrides sectarianism in Northern Ireland is curiosity. I did some work with the police, their cultural awareness program, and we brought priests and Republicans and loyalist paramilitaries into the police training centre to have discussions. And I just noticed there that curiosity about the other was almost stronger than the wariness. I think one of the sad things is that you nearly have to fully declare yourself before you go into issues. Now, in some ways that's easy if you've got a name like Malachi O, because then everybody knows that you're of a Catholic Irish background. But still in all, then you're maybe better making it clear beforehand that you're not pro-violent republicanism, or that you stood against that. And then people will relax, at least get that out of the way, rather than sit in front of you wondering. And sometimes people will only hear me being a Catholic and assume that I'm a Republican, which any Republican in the country would laugh at, But yes, I mean, the important thing, I think, is to walk your own line, have a detached view of things, speak plainly what you really think, don't adopt party lines and ideologies. And maybe one of the things that did help me in getting that more detached perspective was the time living in India and abroad. I mean, I had quite a lot of time outside of Northern Ireland. And people do sometimes say to me, I don't really get you, Malachi. Why have you got no sympathy for people? After all, you were there too, Well, I was there too. I did have, armed IRA men on my doorstep, and I was put up against the wall by British soldiers and slapped about and worse, But I still, I still have a responsibility to think my own way through it and not take instruction from anyone else.
And then on your Wikipedia page, I don't know, have you read it recently? It says that besides the journalism and so forth, you dabble in drama and fiction. So do you find that I know that may have been before you published a novel. Do you find more freedom once you move into fiction to go where you want to go, or what's the draw?
Well, I mean, Terry Brankin Has a gun is pure propaganda. But it is very much an exercise in thinking through the logic of the paramilitary campaigns and the peace process. There are characters representing positions and they interact with each other. So I suppose in some ways it's discursive, it's an intellectual exercise. I mean, one of the things that Jan and Rosemary will tell us, you must never write a propagandist novel. You must never, a novel of ideas mustn't betray itself as such. You can't just launch into a discourse in the middle of a story. And I hope I don't, But still in all, you've got Terry Brankin, the former IRA man, who will defend what he did. And you've got the evangelical Protestant policeman, Basil McCaig, who doesn't believe in the justice of this world. And you have got the hard contemporary IRA man protecting the peace process, Ig Murray, and so on. And you have the women, holding the positions that they do, which are, well, the Irish, it was Docherty accused me of being sexist. I don't think it's sexist, but I mean, essentially, to be really simplistic about it, there's Kathleen, Terry's wife, who lived through a part of the Troubles and saw horrible things happen and wants to keep it at a distance, but won't listen to any excuses for why people did horrible things. And there's, and there's others. What was the question?
Oh no, I was just asking to what extent fictionalizing allows one to step away from some of the restrictions of journalism. And
yeah, well, if you're interviewing somebody for a story, you can't tell them what to say. Whereas if you've got a character and if you create a character for a novel, You can follow them wherever they go, you know.
Yeah.
But it's still storytelling, you know. It is
Of course.
storytelling. There is something about, you know, that little story about Leslie Carroll, you know, is I didn't think of it at the time I wrote it because it fits in a larger chapter as a coherent piece. But essentially, it is a coherent little story, you know, and it is about how religious thinking interacts with violence, and how it becomes almost an absolution of violence, or at least an ignoring of violence. And yet, you know, in the end, it also comes round that the soldier who stopped the car for the killers gave himself up because of a religious conversion at an evangelical tent, you know.
Okay, I'm interested in all three of you, just with the idea, for want of a better term, let's just say we're talking about post-Troubles fiction, for the sake of argument.
Of it what?
We're 20 years on from when things were active or happening. So, for instance, a figure like Sammy Agnew, I mentioned earlier, John, who figures in The Firestarters, he's a former loyalist paramilitary, isn't that right? How did you get a handle on that character? Was it based on people you knew? Were there interviews involved? How do you actually enter that world?
I don't really do research before a novel. I follow the kind of, I'm quite glad Hilary Mantel actually said this at the Edinburgh Book Festival, so it's given me liberty to do this now. She said, you know, when you go to do research, go in with the story that you want to tell and find the research that backs it up. And I tend to take that line of writing. So I knew that I wanted to write Sammy's story. I wrote it, and then I went back and verified the bits that needed verification. Sammy's a composite of lots of men that I've met. I've been working in community arts facilitation in the North for 20 years, and a lot of it in the last decade has been with older people, and quite often with groups of older men and men's sheds and things like that. And I've met parts of Sammy in so many different older men in Belfast. And I think the predominant thing about Sammy that I wanted to get across is not the loyalist background or the legacy of what he's done. It's the silence. And I think it's there in a lot of men, not just older men in Northern Ireland, but this idea that they need to talk about what they've done, what they've seen, what they've been through, and they don't talk. And because of that, it starts to kind of ruin every part of their life and corrupt the people around them. So with Sammy, I really wanted to explore, yes, the legacy of the Troubles, but that kind of idea of silencing.
I've got a longish quote now. I'm going to read it out that you said once. I think I read this in the Times, I'm not sure. The Troubles is too less a word for this. It's a word for minor inconveniences, such as an overdrawn bank account, slow puncture, or a woman's time a month. It is not a violent word. Surely we have earned ourselves a violent word, something as blunt and brutal as apartheid. A very strong statement. I think we do have that tendency to put a milder word on things in this part of the world. So the Troubles are famously down here. We didn't have a Second World War. We had the emergency, and that was 6 years. Were you trying to suggest that by using safe words, we're getting away from the brutal reality and that we need to have a sharper language? Was that the thought there?
I guess that's a quote from the Firestarters. That's the opening section of it. And one of the things I wanted to do with the book is look at language within the context of Northern Ireland and how it's a nebulous concept. I mean, there's no such thing as the truth in Northern Ireland. It's a story that's told different ways depending on who's telling it, and even words have different meanings to different people. And so that the first chapter begins with an unpicking and unraveling of the language that we use around what happened and what is still happening in Northern Ireland. And I'm really, really interested in that. Sometimes I think it's because there's so many flipping poets in Northern Ireland, but they've really made me pay attention to words and sentences and the meaning of words. So I'm always looking very closely at how one word can ricochet in 1,000 different ways, and there's no other place in the world that can do that as well as Northern Ireland. My Spanish translator today is talking online about the difficulty of trying to translate the word yo into Spanish, and she just can't get the inflection that sometimes it can be sarcastic and sometimes it can be celebratory and sometimes it can be about making somebody feel this small. Because that's what we do with language in Northern Ireland. We're really flexible with it, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I was so drawn to Kieran Carson when he was writing. He was always honing in on the contradictions of language and even the different pronunciations, let alone meanings of the words, like H rather than H and things like that. Rosemary, Man of the North, I think, was a story where you again were looking at a former terrorist, shall we say, for want of a better word. Again, I remember coming across something you said about putting yourself in dangerous positions sometimes with regard to research, and there was a story about a wheelie bin and the threat of being set on fire inside it. So can you tell us a little bit again about this idea of finding out these stories, unearthing these stories that you might want to include?
Yeah, I'm unlike Jan, who says she does her research later. I tend to do the research first and then write about it. So I would like immerse myself in a situation. If I want to write about the bonfire, I'll go and hang out at a bonfire. And for the story, The Man in the North, Man of the North you mentioned, yeah, so basically it was an IRA ex-bomber who, it was based on the story he told me. So I do love that kind of whole real legitimized stories and getting those details that I could never invent. You know, there's so much about that we just don't know. You know, I know Malachi, and that's the strength of Terry Brankin's Got a Gun as well, because it's that, you know, that whoever has written that knows the real scenario, and I love that authenticity.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
That's almost a nice segue to read from. I won't have you read from it just yet, Malachi, because I'll just ask you more or less the same question with regard to, I don't know, I suppose you've more an expectation that you will be asking direct questions to certain people.
Well, for instance, the next book, the book that I'm currently working on, which is due for publication next August, is provisionally called The Year of Chaos. I mean, that is, before lockdown, I had done several interviews for that, and then I had to use a lot of archival research. But that is based on personal interviews with former paramilitaries, loyalist and Republican. And you know, these are men of my generation now, you know, and it's a good 20 or 30 years since any of them has killed anybody. But they have killed people, and they certainly have tried to kill people, and they have a version of events, you know, which for them is or was at the time the rock solid truth of what was going on. One of the things that came out of it for me was how many of them were just minors at the time, like 16 years old, when they first had a gun in their hands, or when they first planted a bomb. The other thing that came out is how skewed their perception of what was going on was. I mean, one of them, for instance, told me that he had witnessed the rioting in Belfast in August 1969. Now, most of the gunfire that night was, you know, these big heavy machine guns on top of police armored cars. But he was only 14 at the time, and he thought that was the IRA attacking the Shankill, you know. And when he joined the Young Citizen Volunteers and then the UVF, it was on that kind of understanding, you know. And so a lot of the troubles, and I do call it the troubles because I don't like the word conflict and I don't like the word war, but a lot of it was grounded on misunderstanding, and a lot of it was coming from young people. I mean, one loyalist paramilitary was making nail bombs for riots at the age of like 15, 16. And what he'd started out as a gang member fighting other Protestants. And then the paramilitaries came along and tapped him on the shoulder one day and said, look, cut this out. You know, if you want to fight, fight Tiggs, you know,
Mhm.
and you know, and that was how it happened. You know, it wasn't that you know, he'd read the you know, some of the literature of the provisional Sinn Féin and been appalled by their vision for Ireland. You know,
Sure, yeah, yeah.
it was gut response to circumstances, and those circumstances would have included bombings in his own neighborhood, which would have turned him, you know. But I don't have difficulty talking to people like that. I really do enjoy the company of people like that sometimes. And I think Rosemary probably would too. Embarrassment comes up sometimes. There's one guy, and he's in the book, and I've spoken to him before, and yet when I was at Queen's as writer in residence, I got an approach from a Protestant man who wanted to write a book, and he named this man, and he says, "I believe this is the man who shot dead somebody very close to me," and he said, would you be amenable to finding out? And I couldn't find out, but I still, in all, when I met this man again, and I'm sitting in a car with him, and I'm driving him somewhere, and I'm chatting to him, I'm still thinking, you know, it's not theoretical anymore. It's not just his memories of what he did. It's somebody else saying that man shot my friend, and that's a question that I had difficulty with, and that must be a situation that a lot of journalists in Belfast are familiar with, you know, because journalism can take you into quite matey situations where you get pally and amenable to people who've done ghastly things because you're hoping to get a story out of them, you know, and at the same time you wonder, you know, am I betraying somebody here? Am I letting somebody down quite badly? Because, you know, if so-and-so saw me having a laugh and a joke with this guy, he'd never speak to me again.
Sure, yeah, yeah,
You know?
yeah. Well, perhaps we'd invite you up to, I keep saying up, you don't have to stand, but to read a little bit from Terry Brankin Has a Gun, if that's
Okay,
okay.
you're happy for that. Terry Brankin did something really ghastly some many years ago, and a child died as a consequence. A whole family died. His wife, Kathleen, who herself has been through some fairly horrible experiences that we haven't yet heard about, and isn't naive about what the troubles were like, still in all is appalled to realize that her husband did that he killed a family. And so she has left the family home. She's going to sort out her own head. They're a reasonably wealthy family now. They own houses that they let out to students in the Holy Lands area of Belfast. And she goes and she takes one of those houses for the night just to be away from him and to think about it. At first, dreamily, Kathleen persuaded herself that the alarming sound of breaking glass had come from the party below her window and that she could go back to sleep. But then she registered that there was now only silence outside and that the damage was closer, in fact, inside the room. Clawing her way back from preoccupations that she couldn't recall, she resented the feeling that she was missing something. But the smell of petrol was not from some revved up car. It was a vapor close enough to be irksome, like filth in her nose and gullet. She knew by the feel of heat on her face that she was in trouble, even before she saw flames crackling through the curtains. She had to wake herself up and get out of there. And she was naked. She whipped the duvet from the bed and tried to fold herself into it, but tripped over. She scolded herself, bundled up the duvet and ran out of the room, hoping as she scuttled down the stairs, she'd be able to cover herself before she reached the street. She stopped at her front door. Downstairs still looked normal. She took seconds to wrap the duvet round herself, and then the door came crashing through and a man tumbled over her. His skin was on her skin. His hand pressed into her in the dark as he lifted himself up. He was wearing boxer shorts and trainers and stepped on her while getting off her. He rallied himself. "Get out, missus, get out!" It was Ginger, one of the boys from next door. He fumbled the duvet over her as she tried to stand, but she snatched it from him and ran into the street. "She's all right," Ginger was shouting. "I got her out." Kathleen tried to calm herself and see what was happening. She was barefoot on tarmac. The red paint on her toenails looked absurd now. Cathal and the girl approached her timidly, staring at this wild, frantic woman and then at the flames at her window. "Did one of you bastards do this?" she yelled at them. The girl called the emergency services on her mobile, and Cathal and Ginger ran into the house to beat out the flames, so the fire was dead before the first tender arrived. "You'll want a clean pair of knickers, won't you, missus?" said the girl caustically.
Great, thanks a lot, Malachi. Now, I've about a half dozen more questions I'd love to ask,
Yeah.
but we're getting very, very near the end of our time. I'll just ask one more question, and then I'll say the thank yous. And I suppose it's this: I lived for 7 years in the 90s in the UK, in England, in the south of England, and I was always amazed at the absolute ignorance people had with regard to anything, pretty much beyond England, but certainly in relation to Ireland, or Northern Ireland. And I remember Brian Friel once said, I think it was at the time that Field Day was being set up and translations was being produced, that what we need to do in Ireland is have a conversation among ourselves. And if it happens to be overheard in London or in Washington, so much the better. So what kind of conversations should we have to be overheard? Let me just put it that way, if that makes sense. What kind of
Well, I think I am doing that.
representations will be listened to?
Yeah, I think that is what I'm doing. I think, you know, for my latest couple of books, I've had a London publisher, but most of them have been published in Ireland, and most of them in Northern Ireland. And I mean, the question is, do we need to have a conversation in the South as well? Because I've been invited to more festivals in Scotland than I have in Dublin. So there's a kind of a border, cultural border that's real enough. But I do think, for me, the biggest concern is propaganda and the rewriting of history. And I want to leave something on the record that undermines the propaganda.
Okay.
Are we going to mention Brexit? Got to mention Brexit, yes. Yeah, obviously we need, yeah, I guess in terms of England, it's just the fact of always being ignored as the problem, the former problem that has been solved and is no more interesting. And I think that's really what we have to fight against and say that we're relevant, modern thinkers, and we have a lot to talk about.
Great. Okay. Any thoughts, Jen?
Yeah, many thoughts. I guess I've been thinking a lot at the minute about silencing and the different kinds of silencing that have gone on in regards to Northern Ireland. So I think, yes, there is this silencing of not listening to us. And when it comes to that, I think all the stories need to be told, not just the political stories and the stories of the Troubles, but the stories of everyday life, because there's a lot of folks there's a lot of folks in England who have never gone any further north than London. And they don't, you know, it's not just Northern Ireland that's been silenced. There's whole parts of the UK that they're not aware of what life is like there. But I also think there's a silencing that happens with the wrong narratives coming across. And I guess I think I grew up very rarely hearing a Northern Irish accent on the BBC. And when you did, it was usually somebody who was a terrorist or violent or an alcoholic. And some of the voices, the way we've been portrayed, it actually adds to the silencing. So I think we have to be careful about those, you know, what are those narratives that get told? And the last thing that I'll say is, I think I've become really conscious since lockdown happened of the kind of echo chamber that Ireland can be as well. I've been very fortunate and I have been invited to, I think, almost all of the festivals in the south of Ireland and the north. But I think sometimes we just bounce off each other. And I've been so fortunate in lockdown has shoved me online to doing things more internationally and talking to Ukrainian writers and writers in Belarus and writers in Croatia and Kashmir and all over the place. And we need to have those conversations as well, because there's so much learning that needs to be done there.
Okay, terrific. So I'd like to thank, first of all, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, who very generously have sponsored this event. And then very warm thanks to Jan Carson, to Rosemary Jenkinson, and to Malachi O. Docherty. Thank you very much, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
David.
Now.
Bye.